All right. So welcome to Shorebirds Lite. Get ready for that late summer push. It's where we are right now. Um, this is, of course, a shorebird, and whether you know it or not, without the head and without an entire picture of the bird, this is still completely identifiable. And it's
Yeah.
identifiable because of those
Oh,
markings
yeah.
right there on the tertials. We'll get into that.
Yes.
We'll get into that a little bit later. But anyway, first, I wanted to show you some exciting news. Eric shared with me that the AOS, the American Ornithological Society, has just published its 66th supplement of the checklist of North American birds. So that's just 4 days ago now. They published the supplement. Now, originally the supplement was published in like the 1890s, I think, and they think they keep adding supplements to it every year of taxonomy, lumps, and splits, and things like that. Now, the most interesting thing that popped up on a quick review was that the warbling vireo is being split into two species, according to the AOS. That doesn't mean that eBird is going to echo this, but it does mean that many authorities believe that the eastern warbling vireos and the western warbling vireos are separate species. So I took a quick look at my life list to see how many birds of the eastern warbling vireo I had seen. And I grew up in Boston, so I saw a lot of them there, and I saw them in Michigan, and I've seen them in Florida. So when and if they split the species officially on eBird, I'll get a new species without even doing anything. So I'm pretty excited about that. But you might, if you use eBird, you might go take a look at your eBird history and see if you've seen warbling vireo east of the Rockies. And if you have, it's very possible in the future you might get a new species without,
Hmm.
just sitting in your chair. So anyway, the next thing I want to ask you is, are summer doldrums real? We keep hearing about how boring birding in summer is because all the singing has stopped, the movement has stopped, there's no migration going on. And actually, I beg to differ. I think back in 2000, I think I wrote it 2020. Sorry, I wrote an article about what to look for um, in spring and summer, late summer, and I described something called froth. And froth, in my mind, if you imagine um, spring migration as being an incoming wave, and that incoming wave sloshes over the rocks and it floods the tide pools right here. And then what happens with all the froth? It kind of swirls around, moves around in that pool. Now, that's sort of where I think we are in mid-spring. After most of the migrants have arrived, that's the incoming wave. And then before the water really rushes out, which represents fall migration, we see a lot of this froth moving around in the shallow pools. Now, in that froth, I think, has come some birds like the black tern of Shoreline Lake and the least bittern of Calero Reservoir. And most recently, maybe some of you can guess what I'm going to say, but most recently, one of the new kind of surprising birds that showed up in midsummer was the zone-tailed hawk. And I know probably at least 100 people went to go chase this bird. It has been in the county 3 prior times, and I've missed every single one. So this time I was really excited about going to see the zone-tailed hawk, and Eric and my friend Melnick and my wife Cricket and I went out looking for it, and we bumped into like 40 other people that were chasing this bird. So this is why I think summer doldrums are fictional. I think summer is filled with surprises, and you could see it in every single year as you look back in our county's bird history. There are surprising birds that show up in summer. So don't lose interest in summer just because it's hot, just because migration has finished. just because you believe there's no surprises and everybody tells you there's nothing new happening in summer, summer is a great time to go birding. So anyway,
Is that
and
was that your photo?
yeah, well, it was a back of camera photo of my photo. Uh,
Okay.
yeah. So, I mean, what explains this? Could it be changing climate? Could it be the available habitat or food? Could it be the historic drought? I think you could make an argument that any of these explanations fit why we see so many interesting birds. But I forgot to add that birds have wings and they do show up in places where you don't really expect sometimes. And that's why summer is so wonderful. So just pick your favorite explanation and go with that because I don't think there's a wrong answer. Now, to the task at hand. Shorebirds in summertime. Now you'll look here in like the June, July time period. Santa Clara County, this is a portion of our checklist of shorebirds for Santa Clara County. There are not a lot of migrant shorebirds in our county. You see that green bar, there's not a lot happening in there. Many vacant months, weeks. However, where we are right now in August, not only have some of the wintering birds arrived, but we see right now a lot of migrant birds that are going to spend a very brief time in our county. I'm looking at Baird's sandpiper about a third of the way down, and I'm looking at Pectoral sandpiper, which should arrive toward the end of this month. And I'm looking at the Phalaropes, which have been here a brief time, but we should be able to see those right now. So in particular, look at the Dunlin. There was a recent report of Dunlin that was quite extraordinary because right now the Dunlin should be very rare. It is traditionally a late migrant, so it doesn't really show up until September in any significant numbers. In fact, you might argue that it doesn't show up until October in significant numbers. And Pectoral sandpiper is just around the corner. We should see that a report of that, probably Kai Ting or somebody else who birds regularly will spot it. And but it's going to be right on time, just like the solitary sandpiper. In fact, the one seen this weekend was a little bit early before the bulk of the reports next month. So the checklist tells you some interesting stories, and I would make sure that you have a current checklist for wherever you decide to go birding. And with shorebirds in particular, each of these little bar charts tells an interesting story about migration. You can see whether it breeds here, whether it just winters here, or whether it just passes through, like the Baird's sandpiper. And you might wonder why it doesn't pass through in spring. Anyway, we'll get to that. So the first thing I want to start off with is a bunch of easy stuff. And then we're going to get to the very difficult stuff, and you know, by the third hour we'll cover the very difficult stuff. But American avocet, a really familiar bird, of course, that's the Santa Clara Valley Bird Alliance's mascot bird. Here we are seeing it in its winter plumage, and we are seeing it in sort of its transition plumage from winter to spring. So this is probably late winter. And here we have mid-spring, a beautiful orange-headed, orange-necked adult bird. So nothing very complicated about this species. I think everybody recognizes it. It's got incredible field marks. It's very easy to find. It's conspicuous. And in flight, it has this wonderful black and white pattern on its wings. Now, there is a difference between male and female, which might be new to some of you, but the male and female can be distinguished by the length and shape of their bills. The male tends to have a straighter bill. Often it's a little bit shorter than the females. The females have an abruptly upturned bill. Both bills are upturned, but the female is more abruptly, more strongly upturned. And it's been observed, this is David Sibley's diagram, it's been observed that the head feathers are a little bit more, I guess, erect on the female. Like she has more of a bulbous forehead. I haven't personally observed this. Maybe some of you have, but it's something that you can look at through photographs And I'll show you how to do that a bit later. But we should watch for this as well. I mean, because we're scraping for any tools we can use to identify birds. And in this case, it's fun to figure out who's the male and who's the female. Now, in flight, they always show this really contrasty black and white pattern, which my personal theory is, and I haven't heard it contradicted, is that this is a bit of a disruptive pattern, which you might see in zebras. So it makes it a little bit harder for a predator to find an individual bird if their wings are so stripy and patterned. Plus, they do form pretty tight flocks, like this herd of zebra. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the avocet. I'm going to move to the black-necked stilt. Very common, very familiar, beautiful long-legged black and white bird. The male, of course, is jet black, sometimes even glossy black, like a blackbird, whereas the female tends to show a little bit more brownish or charcoal on the back, less glossy. So this is very fun to look for, and especially in spring when you see two adults with a young bird, you can guarantee one's going to be an adult female and one's going to be an adult male, and you can search for them there, because side by side it's very easy to see that difference. In flight, they're pretty dramatic because their legs stretch way behind the tail. Hence the name stilt. These are proportionally the longest legged shorebirds in the world, the whole family of stilts. And there's really no confusing this bird with anything else except perhaps an orca, because the pattern is nearly identical with a white spot behind the eye and the white throat. Of course, the orca is a little bit larger and spends most of its time underwater. So probably no problem identifying them there. Let's move to willet, another very common species. This is a willet shown in winter plumage, very smooth gray, actually quite drab. This is a fairly large shorebird. We're even larger than the stilt and the avocet. In breeding plumage, they show really remarkable pattern of spots and stripes and bars. We see this occasionally in late winter, just before the migrant birds move to Northern California and Canada to breed. But when they fly, they also show a really remarkable bright black and white plumage. And someone told me once, when you have a question about shorebird, ask yourself, will it have stripes? And then, of course, the answer is yes, willets have stripes. So that's interesting to look for. They have this disruptive pattern too, but in this case, I think maybe this highly recognizable pattern at a distance is something more akin to team uniforms. This is a way for the birds to find each other. They recognize that flash of black and white. It's not quite as disruptive as the zebras or the avocets, but it does serve a function. Let's go to killdeer. Our most common plover. This is an adult bird with black rings. This is a slightly younger bird with brownish rings. There are always two rings, and a fair amount of rufous, or some bit of rufous on the neck, the side of the neck. And they are amazingly falcon-like sometimes. I have often seen killdeer flying overhead or in the distance low over the marsh and thought, gosh, that looks like a kestrel. Well, in fact, I don't think that's that crazy, because they both have reddish on the tail. With the killdeer, it's on the rump, and with the kestrel, it's on the interior webbing of the feathers of the tail. Nevertheless, there's a similarity there that I wonder if it's coincidental or whether there's some reason behind it. We do know that the killdeer, like all plovers, in fact, have a broken wing display. All the species of plovers worldwide have a display like this. But for us in North America, the killdeer is the most familiar because it's the most dramatic. When it parts its wings like this and limps along in front of you on the dirt or in the grass, it is distracting you to a predator that looks like a wound. And a wounded species, a wounded animal in front of a predator looks like a target. So they're going to change their attention from whatever they were looking at before to looking at this blood-colored wound on the back of the killdeer. Of course, it springs into action as soon as it lures you away from the nest. And this is something that I've seen many, many times in gravelly areas and in fields where the killdeers are nesting. They'll do this to pull you away from the nest, and then they sort of laugh at you when they spring into action and fly away completely healthy. But by that time, you are disoriented and lost in the middle of a field and nowhere near the nest that they've been protecting. Semipalmated plover is like a tiny killdeer, but with only one ring instead of two. So this is an adult, and I think we're gonna we're gonna hear it there. Petweep, petweep. In winter, they lose a little bit of that contrast. They become a little duller. The black ring around the neck is somewhat reduced, but they still only ever have one ring. So it's fairly easy to identify, quite a bit smaller than the killdeer. And they're really fond of mud. So you'll see them on muddy mud flats, wet mud flats, places where snowy plovers are generally not found, places where killdeers may be found, which is good actually, because then you see the huge size difference between them. But if you can see that one ring versus two, you know you've got a semipalmated. In flight, they're pretty compact. They're really a very handsome, small shorebird. Snowy plover, of course, really has no ring. There's a little bit of black that comes down the side of the neck or the side of the shoulder, but it doesn't meet ever on the chest. So side by side, the difference is pretty significant. Not only is the snowy plover whiter, but the ring is much less pronounced. And it also prefers a different habitat. It prefers either sandy areas or very...
I don't know how to get your volume.
Pardon? My volume is up all the way.
Yeah, it's not very loud.
Oh, Larry. Sorry.
That's okay. So anyway, the snowy plover is a lot brighter, more white on the breast and belly and throat. No dark ring around the breast or neck. But what I was saying is that it actually prefers a different habitat, drier, paler. I mean, a pale substrate like bright white sand or bright white salt. So the places where this bird is found are often very uninhabitable for other shorebirds because it's dry, it's salty. The salt basins in the Alviso ponds are probably one of the better places to look for the snowy plover. But you'll really never find the semi-palmated plover there. You'll find them in the damp, muddy, flooded areas. Black-bellied plover, again, these are the simplest birds in our area, and hopefully this is helping kind of put them in a bit of context. The black-bellied plover is a lot larger than the killdeer by a significant amount, twice as big easily, maybe 3 times as large as a semi-palmated or snowy plover. In breeding plumage, it's recognizable. It tells you what it's called. It's got a black belly. That's the black-bellied plover. And it has a very mournful call. In fall, however, they lose that black belly. And you might be wondering, well, how do we tell them apart from some of the other plovers? Well, the easy way to tell them is that they always have black underarms. These are called axillaries. These are the feathers that smooth out the transition between the underwing and the side of the body. So these are always black in the black-bellied plover. It's what's left over of the black belly. And no other plovers have got this mark. So if you're looking at a large plover, of course, plovers have short bills and large eyes. This is because they're all primarily nocturnal hunters. They forage at night and in low light, and they use their large eyes to spot prey. So they actually move differently than the other shorebirds. They walk and stand, they run and stand, and they're waiting to see if anything moves as a result of their movement. The other shorebirds sort of probe in the mud, and they don't really do anything by sight, they do it all by feel. So plovers, family-wide, hunt by sight. Marbled godwit, again, a very familiar species. One of our largest shorebirds. It's tan and mottled and with a extremely long bill that's slightly upturned. You can see that here. But notice all the cinnamon coloration on the wings here. This is a really beautifully colored mottled bird. And I think we have a call here. So these birds are present year-round. However, they don't breed here. The ones that remain during the breeding season are non-breeding birds. Many of them are juveniles, or they're not feeling up to the migration to the grassland where they breed. But they form large groups, and those large groups are often mixed with willets and dowitchers and other birds. But this is a much larger bird. A long-billed curlew is even larger than the marbled godwit, and of course it has that very long bill that is specifically designed for grabbing grasshoppers in its native grassland. So when it's breeding, which is now nowhere near here, where they breed in central southern Canada, they are foraging for katydids and grasshoppers and other insects in the prairies. So that bill is perfectly designed for that. They reach forward and then grab the insects with that bill. The godwits, however, are actually probing in the mud where they breed, and they're looking for other kinds of creatures. So despite the fact that these shorebirds are similar in size and occasionally difficult to distinguish if you don't see the bill, they have very different feeding styles. I think we have a call here. That call actually is supposed to say curlew, curlew, curlew. That's why they're called curlews. So here you can see the godwit, marbled godwit on A, and the long-billed curlew on B. You can see the different shape in the bill. They both have a fair amount of cinnamon. They both have long legs. So until you see that bill and that face, it can be difficult to tell, although the curlew is a little bit larger. Which brings me to a slightly smaller large shorebird called the Whimbrel. You might notice right away that there's no cinnamon color on here, and that the bill, while it's curved and long, is not as long as the curlew. So here you can actually see a curlew and a Whimbrel side by side. Now, I just told you that the Whimbrel B is grayer than the curlew A, and that is generally true. But in this picture, it's not really showing that. What it is showing is the heavy stripes on the head of the Whimbrel and the shorter, heavier, thicker bill of the Whimbrel. That's the curlew. And Whimbrel actually quite fond of rocks and rocky shores and the immediate shore. So we tend to get fewer Whimbrels here than we get godwits because the mudflats are not really the purview of the Whimbrel. It's generally rocky shores. So when you go to the coast, you're likely to see large groups of Whimbrel, whereas here you see 2 or 3, maybe 4 at a time in the South Bay. Wilson snipe, again, a pretty highly recognizable bird and quite common. They look an awful lot like a dowitcher, but there are some important differences. One is the Wilson snipe is usually hidden, so they tend to stay. They don't like to be seen. In other words, they don't like to be exposed. They'd much rather stay hidden, and they spend a lot of the day sleeping, and they come out at dusk and dawn when they're most active and they feel safest. So this is a very typical look of a snipe, whereas the one I showed you a moment ago is uncommon. We don't see them like this very often, but when we do, notice those very powerful white stripes moving lengthwise on the body, on the back. This is really important because Dowitchers, which superficially look similar, don't have these. They have a very different pattern. For example, right here, you might be able to pick out the Dowitcher in this group of 3 birds. There are 2 snipe and there's 1 Dowitcher. So look for those stripes on the back, and you see those on A and you see them on C, but you don't really see them on B. That's the short-billed Dowitcher with his head underwater. We'll go over that a little bit more later. Black oystercatcher, I think this is one of the last really easy birds here. All dark, bright red bill. Used to be very difficult to find in Santa Clara County, but now we just go to Shoreline Lake and they're right there, 1 or 2 on the island. So that's pretty exciting because this is almost more than any other bird, a rock-loving coastal species. So to have it show up in the South Bay is quite remarkable. But over the decades, they have found their way underneath the Golden Gate Bridge and then down along the peninsula and into the East Bay. And they've made their way first from San Francisco to Pacifica, Daly City, down through San Mateo County, and then finally in Santa Clara County, we have them pretty regularly at Shoreline Lake and other areas where they're able to find mussels. That bright red bill, that thick red bill, which is quite razor-like in fact, is designed to sever the mussel on a mussel so they can gobble up the meat inside of the shell. So the oyster catchers do exactly that. May not be oysters here, but definitely mussels. Where are there lots of mussels? Shoreline Lake. So they found their way there, and they found their way to Redwood Shores and Coyote Point and all kinds of places where mussels can be found stuck to the rocks. I've always thought the black oyster catcher was a poor name because really it's quite brown. Anyway, I don't know if anybody will listen to me, but I think brown oyster catcher would be a better name. There's really nothing you could confuse it with except maybe a crow holding a red ruler, because there's really nothing else that's all dark with a big red fin in its mouth. So just keep that in mind. Now, we're going to get to a little bit harder stuff. Does anybody have any questions before I continue? Anybody at all? No? Okay, then I'll keep going. So the harder stuff. Let's talk about juvenile birds and also juvenile plumage. This is quite important because right now we have a mixture of post-breeding adults and immatures flying into our county and landing in our ponds and on our mudflats. And here we have 2 species. We've got western flycatcher on the western sandpiper and least sandpiper. B is least sandpiper. So you may notice a few differences here. Would anybody like to offer a few differences that they're seeing here before I keep going? Give you a chance to see if you are noticing some differences here.
Leg color.
Leg color is different for sure. It's very dark blackish on the western sandpiper and kind of mustard yellow on the least sandpiper. Any other differences?
The
No.
western has more white on the chest.
The western flycat, there we go again. Western sandpiper has got a lot more white on the chest and the throat, it looks like. The face even looks whiter on western sandpiper.
Yellow
B
legs.
has yellow legs.
these-
A has white. B has yellow legs.
That's right. Yep, yellowish legs, kind of mustard color.
And the beak is on the western is much stronger than the beak on the least.
Yeah, it's definitely longer, and I think you're going to see some more differences when I go forward. So these are both juveniles, and I want to highlight how you recognize a juvenile because it's really important. So with the least sandpiper, this is a spring adult. So it's got a lot of color on it. The feathers look slightly disorganized, I would say, but there's definitely color there. And these are the only birds you're going to see in spring. So spring adult, least sandpiper. Now, when we get to a summer adult, some of the fringing on the edges of the feathers has started to wear away. And that gives it a more muddy appearance. The colors start to blend. They're not so discrete, not so distinct. And the bird is still quite colorful and quite nice looking. But what happens next is by winter, which is what many of our least sandpipers are wearing right now, the winter plumage, those feathers start to kind of drab out. They look sort of uniformly tan or muddy. They're blurry. They don't have the discrete division between one feather to the next. They're a little bit more kind of muted, subdued, faded, if you will. Now, what happens with the juveniles, which are arriving right now, is that they have something really similar to the adult spring plumage, which is colorful and crisp and neatly organized. These feathers are all brand new. The feathers on the least sandpiper I just showed you, they've had those feathers for several months, so it's no wonder they look worn. These are fresh and crisp and clean and colorful, and they have a pale fringing on the edges, which is still intact. Now, I'm showing you a pectoral sandpiper right now because for all intents and purposes, the plumage between a juvenile least sandpiper and a juvenile pectoral sandpiper is pretty similar. So, but we can recognize this bird right here as a juvenile because of this nice, crisp, clean, neatly separated feathers, highly patterned and organized. So we'll come back to pectoral sandpiper, but interesting thing about pectoral sandpiper is that while it has kind of many similar plumage features to the least sandpiper juvenile, it's twice as big. So if you see them together, there's no mistaking them. But we're going to come back to that. So here's another juvenile. This is Baird's sandpiper, my personal favorite. Look how crisp and clean those feathers are. They're all neatly demarcated in a way that an adult in post-breeding worn plumage would never be. So this crisp, clean, and in many cases colorful plumage is a hallmark of juvenile shorebirds. So right now, just to refresh, we see a lot of post-breeding adults, which look sort of worn and faded, and the feathers are kind of messy and slightly disorganized or ragged looking, whereas the juveniles all have this really nice, crisp, kind of filigree pattern. So that's the biggest difference right there. Now, with Baird sandpiper, we'll get to this a bit later too, the primary feathers are very, very long. So it gives this bird a very stretched out appearance. It looks very long-winged. A lot of times people will say that looks like a long tail, but it's in fact, those are the long wing feathers that extend well beyond the tail. So I want to compare a few of the most common birds so we can get some experience doing this. So as mentioned, the spring adult, the summer adult least sandpiper is colorful. The fall adult least sandpiper is a little brownish and faded and blurry. And I have always called these brownie because they look kind of brown, kind of tan. Whereas the juveniles are really crisp and colorful and very, very clean looking. They haven't spent their entire summer raising young. They just emerged from the nest. They've escaped the house and they are on their own now, and they still look fresh and clean and happy, and none of them are cynical yet. So Western sandpiper has a pretty similar story. The breeding adult, the summer adult, has nice red suspenders on the back, a lot of red on the face and crown, and nice crisp markings on the breast. Well, come fall, these turn sort of frosty. So I always call these frosties. They're white on the face, white on the breast. They don't really have the bib of the least sandpiper we just saw. And they tend to be sort of grayish. So they're gray and they're frosty. They're not brown. They're grayish. The juveniles show up and they have adopted some portion of the adult breeding plumage. They've got those red suspenders on the back. But look how nice and tidy those feathers are compared to the adult above it. We see the individual feathers all nicely fringed. So here's your first quiz. If I were to tell you that there was a western sandpiper and a least sandpiper in this picture, would you be able to pick them out?
Yes,
Yes.
Good, good. So which is which?
B is the least.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
A is western. So notice, now, while I keep saying gray and brown, keep in mind that, I paint and draw a lot. So I'm used to seeing color differences that may not be super obvious to other folks. But it seems pretty clear to me that A is grayer than B, which is browner. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I'm hoping that you can see that as well, because that'll be important, especially when we see flocks of these birds. Now, here are the juveniles. So we have the western on the left and the least on the right. We can see that there is red suspenders on the western sandpiper juvenile, but not much else in the way of color. Whereas the least sandpiper has a fair amount of rufous across the entire upper parts. Now, we could also talk about the bill. The bill is much longer on a western. The least has the lesser bill, the shorter bill. And you also have the leg colors there. So those are our two peeps, the two most common peeps. Now, Dunlin is a different story. This is famously a late arrival. So there may have been one or two reports of Dunlin so far in the county, but they typically don't arrive until next month or even after that. So fall adults, they have a little bit of black-belly, which is part of their breeding plumage. They're quite stunning in breeding plumage, but we're not at that point right now. Mostly what we're seeing are adult winter birds, like the upper right. And the fall juveniles are very similar, but they tend to show more scalloping on the wings, which you can see on the lower edge of the wing. So I call these blurries because they don't have a lot of obvious pattern. By this point, they're sort of bicolored almost, but it's not even sharply demarcated. It's kind of a blurry transition between upper part to lower part. They're not terribly exciting to look at this time of year, but they sure explode in spring with beautiful colors then. So here we have a blurry and a frosty. We've got a Dunlin and we've got a western sandpiper. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to tell the difference, because the Dunlin is quite a bit larger than the frosty western sandpiper. These are both winter plumages. They both have black legs. They could be confused except for the size. They're very big difference in size. Overall, Dunlin is less streaky than either western or least sandpipers. And I've always noticed the near complete lack of facial patterning. There's a little bit of frostiness over the eye, like a really blurry supercilium, but otherwise the facial expression of a Dunlin looks pretty vacant to me. So I've always thought that, I think, duh. You can't think of what to say, has no reaction to a situation. That's not how the name Dunlin came about. That has more to do with the dun color of the bird. But I can't help but think duh, because he just looks lost. He just doesn't look like he knows what's going on. Anybody have any questions, again, while we have a little break here? Okay, well, you can save questions for the end too, also. So we want to look for structural differences. Between those three species, least, western, and Dunlin, obviously the Dunlin is the largest. And just as far as structural features, I think that least sandpipers feels very compact. It feels very tight in the way it feeds, whereas the western sandpiper seems to be a little bit more front heavy. It tends to lean forward in a way that the least sandpiper doesn't quite do. It's subtle, but I do notice it. And Dunlin, of course, has this very hunched posture, which is not just the diagram here. It really does seem hunched when it forages. You see a gradual lengthening of the bill. You see sort of big jump between western and Dunlin as far as size. So look for those. And here again, we have a Dunlin and we have one of the Peeps. Does anybody want to take a guess at what we're looking at here?
Sure.
What do you see?
Western, at least on the right.
Least on the
East
least is actually on the left. You see there's a
on
little
the
bit
left.
yellowish legs. And the Dunlin, enormous by comparison, and a fairly vacant expression on the face. There's a juvenile Dunlin on the right, B. So let's take a look at what I said was an interesting comparison between least and pectoral sandpiper. Pectoral sandpiper is rare, but I want to point out that it is really similar in coloration and in some features. So it might actually be easy to overlook. I can't tell you how many times people have sent me pictures asking if this is a pectoral sandpiper, and it turns out to be a least juvenile. Just look at the similarity in the rufous on the back and the leg color. But there are some differences. Of course, the bill is yellowish on a pectoral, and the wing feathers, the primaries, extend well beyond the tail again. I should mention that these long primaries are marks of a long distance migrant. So Baird sandpiper, which also had really long wings, and pectoral sandpiper also all fly all the way down to Argentina for their wintering. In fact, I think pectoral sandpiper goes even farther. So that's a really long distance migrant. Least sandpiper doesn't fly that far, so it doesn't need those super long primaries. But anyway, the bill is a good key because it's yellowish on the pectoral sandpiper and the wings are quite long. Whereas the bill on the least sandpiper, of course, is black and shorter. But it's the size difference that really gets me. And it isn't just the size. There's an important difference that has to do with their basic structure. So we've got pectoral on the left, the giant bird, and the least sandpiper on the right, much smaller but similar colors. I've always nicknamed this the greater least sandpiper because so many people have, mistake the least sandpiper for the pectoral and vice versa. But the greater least sandpiper, the pectoral sandpiper, is twice as size. But look how small the head is compared to the body. The red circles are the same size. So that difference in the relationship between the head size and the body size is very important. That small head size suggests we're looking at a larger bird. So if you see a head size on a shorebird that looks, outrageously small compared to the body, consider the possibility that you're looking at a larger bird, larger than you thought you were looking at. So here we go, the fall juvenile, of course, beautiful filigree pattern on the back. There are even some stripes on the fall juvenile. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the snipe. Now I'm going to move on to a really tough one. I should point out that we haven't had any pectoral sandpipers this season yet, but I'm sure we will quite soon. We have had semipalmated sandpiper, and I think many of you have already seen it. But it begs a comparison with Western sandpiper. So let's take a look at these two fall juvenile birds. Again, the juveniles are where it's at right now because they're beautiful. They tend to be highly identifiable. The Western sandpiper juvenile on the left shows those red suspenders, that frosty white face and belly, the black legs. But oh my gosh, we've got a white belly and white face on the semipalmated sandpiper as well. Notice that there's really no rufous on the bird on the right. And maybe, does anybody notice another feature on here that might be useful?
Bill length.
Yeah, the bill length is a lot shorter and it's actually not finely pointed. It's sort of blunt. So semi-palmated sandpiper's got a shorter bill. It's dead straight and it doesn't have any of the droop that the Western sandpipers have. I did mention the Western sandpiper length of bill, but not the droop. We'll see that in a moment. And this front heavy thing that I pointed out, look at this Western sandpiper. It seems front heavy to me, and a lot of people have observed the same thing. Ken Kaufman pointed it out. Pete Dunn pointed it out. They lean forward. They have a heavy head, a heavy body, and it seems as if the legs are not as centrally placed as they are on the semi-palmated. But I think it was Pete Dunn who described the stance, the posture, the movement of a Western sandpiper as being gnomish. And the best way I could demonstrate that is by showing you this wooden toy with a gnome on it. And just imagine how that would move, leaning forward at the waist with this long front heavy weight. So that's kind of where that description comes from. A Baird sandpiper is also rare, but I guarantee we're going to get some, and somebody's going to find it, probably on in Alviso, I'm guessing. They, despite the pictures you're seeing here on mud flat, they tend to prefer kind of cakey, dried edges of ponds. So many of the Alviso ponds are appropriate for that, or Sunnyvale as well. But they don't tend to like mud flats as well as the least sandpiper or the Western sandpiper. They tend to like the drier places. So here we see all juveniles because that's all we pretty much ever see in the county is juveniles. The reason behind that is the majority of juveniles, of adults fly south through the center of the country, whereas the juveniles tend to fly outward along the coasts. No one knows exactly why, but I like to think that the juveniles haven't made that journey before, so they don't know exactly where they're going. They're relying on their guidance system, which is inaccurate without an update, and the update comes by way of making the journey for the first time. So the Baird sandpiper often has a little bit of a bib on the front, and you might think, gosh, that the one in the lower right sure looks like a least sandpiper, but I would point out how long those wings are. It no longer has this compact feeling of the least sandpiper. Gosh, look at those wings, how long those stretch out behind the tail. That's the mark of a juvenile Baird's sandpiper, plus that beautiful crisp fringing on the scapulars and back. I've nicknamed this the long peep because it has a much more stretched out look than any of the other peeps. And it's a little bit larger, not a lot, but a little bit. And if I were to tell you that we had one Baird's and one Western in this picture, I'm sure anybody could, anybody want to identify where the Baird's is or the Western?
A is the Baird's.
Exactly. A is Baird's. You see, it's not that much larger than a Western, but it definitely feels longer. And those wings stretch out long, way behind. Excellent. And here again, so we have one Baird's and one something else. Anybody want to guess which is which and what that something else might be?
Pectoral,
Pectoral, yes. Which one is the Pectoral?
the back one.
Yeah, the A, that's Pectoral. So he's got a little bit of yellow on the bill and yellowish legs. And I mentioned don't be fooled by the muddy legs. This Baird's sandpiper in the foreground, B, actually has mud on its legs, which make the legs look less black than they really are. But notice the bib on both of these birds. This is somewhat different from, definitely different from Western sandpiper, and somewhat different from least sandpiper because it's such an obvious bib. Okay, so comparing size, I already pointed out that Pectoral sandpiper is easily twice as large as a least sandpiper, but Ruff. Here's another one. This is again a rare species, but we get it every year. Somebody's going to find it, and part of tonight is to familiarize you with the most common species, and then point out some of the things you might look for that are possibilities for the coming season. Ruff has, I guess, the epitome of a vacant face, a very plain face. There are very few markings on this face. And look how tiny the head is on these birds. So that should tell you something as to how large this is. This bird can be anywhere from the size of a lesser yellowlegs to a greater yellowlegs. So a good sized shorebird. Here we're looking at some Dowitchers, and we're looking at a ruff. Does anybody want to take a guess where the ruff is?
B.
B is the ruff for sure. Not only do we have the bright orange legs, they can vary from orange to mustard, but they're pretty much always yellowish. But look how short the bill is. And I could be unfair here, but I think the head looks really tiny. Not just because it's a larger bird, but because it's always struck me as having a head too small for its body. So I've nicknamed this tiny head. And we've got two birds here, both with yellowish legs. Anybody want to take a guess what we're looking at here besides the green-winged teal?
I think the ruff is in the back.
Yep, ruff is definitely in the back. So it's a smaller bird, I'm guessing. I know it's farther away, but I'm guessing it's a little bit smaller. But I can see the bill is quite short. And I'm also noticing how kind of pale and unexpressive that face is. Also look at the patterning. We're seeing all this typical spotting and barring is typical for the yellowlegs. Yellowlegs belong to the genus Tringa, and Tringos always have bars and spots like that. Ruffs never do. They have some other features, but they never have those spots and bars like the yellowlegs. So Ruff was A. And here again, we've got two birds. Anybody care to identify what we're seeing here? Look for those bars and spots. Look for these are both birds we've just looked at.
So A is the Baird.
Oh, no, but that's a great guess. I could see why you might have said that. First of all, the wings are not long enough to be a Baird's. The bill is a good shape. The legs on a Baird's would be black. So we're actually looking at a ruff here.
Ruff.
Yeah, but this is informative because ruff is actually pretty variable. It's because of two reasons. One, the male and female are different sizes. The male is about sometimes as much as 30% larger, which complicates things because I just finished telling you compare sizes, but the male is sometimes 30% larger, and also they have different color morphs. Some are barred, some are really pale like this one. The juveniles, of course, have a lot of color. So ruff is quite complicated. But what I would focus on is the shape of the bird. It has long legs, not as long as a yellowlegs, but still quite long, and a very tiny head with a bill that also seems too short for its size. So ruff is a curious one. In my impression, it's kind of a misfit. Was
I
there?
have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
It seems to me that the ruff, like there's more of a scalloped pattern on the feathers that really stands out in all of those photos. Is that just typical for the time of year that they're here?
It's really typical of juveniles, and that's almost always what we get. So yes, you are dead on as far as the scalloping. Plus, they lack the barring of the tringa, the yellow legs. So they're always going to have more of a scalloped impression than the yellow legs, and more than many other shorebirds as well. But remember, a lot of the juveniles have got scalloped patterning on the feathers, on the back and wings. So that's why I'm kind of emphasizing the structure more even than the plumage, because I think that's going to help quite a bit, especially with this one. It's a subtle bird, but it's going to show up, I pretty much guarantee.
Thanks.
This is an old world species. It's previously considered extremely rare. Now it's considered rare. So they've increased in numbers and frequency, and they love the Alviso New Chicago marsh. All right, so greater and lesser yellowlegs. So who's been worried about this one? Because this is a pretty common obstacle for birders. The lesser yellowleg side by side is clearly different. A shorter bill, shorter legs, smaller size. But it's when they're isolated, it can be very hard. Here again, we have them side by side, which is the perfect way to see them. And you notice I'm pointing to A, which is the greater yellowlegs. I'm pointing to the neck. Not only is the neck longer, but the neck seems to be sort of bumpy, lumpy, like it's just swallowed a cherry and it's not all the way down yet. So there tends to be sort of an Adam's apple, I guess, on greater yellowlegs that shows up pretty regularly compared to the lesser yellowlegs, which is shorter necked and smoother necked. Which brings me to another thing. Both the yellowlegs are tringas, and so too is solitary sandpiper. So we see here a darkened version of a yellowleg, darkened in all respects. The legs are duller green, not yellow. The back is darker, the head is darker, the eye ring is more pronounced. The only thing that you're likely to confuse this with, well, I suppose you could confuse it with the yellowlegs, but any good look at the legs would steer you away from that. But the only thing that I think is a reasonable confusing alternative is spotted sandpiper, because they both share that really strong eye ring. They both have dull greenish yellowish legs, and they both have a fairly short bill. But notice how spots extend onto the back of the solitary sandpiper, but not on the spotted sandpiper. But to me, these birds look like a really, a troublesome area, because they are pretty similar. Here we have, maybe this is actually more of a danger for people to confuse the lesser yellowlegs with the solitary sandpiper. They are the same genus. They have very similar style of feeding, very similar sounds, very similar plumage. But the solitary sandpiper is always darker and always is going to have a more pronounced eye ring. He's on the left, solitary on the left, lesser yellowlegs on the right. So it gives you some sense of size too. Lesser yellowlegs is larger than the solitary. And there's one of these right now at Charleston Slough in the forebay. So you can go look for solitary sandpiper tomorrow if you've got time. And here again, we've got two birds, a lesser yellowlegs and a solitary. I think you could probably tell which is which. They both look pretty dark here, but look for the more spots on B, which is the lesser yellowlegs, or spots on that. Now, if you're lucky enough to spend time with the solitary sandpiper and you're able to watch it move, you're going to notice that the tail is not all white. It's actually dark in the center part of the tail. That's quite different from the yellowlegs, which are bright white and barred. But this has got this dark stripe down the center, which gives a totally different impression. And I want to point out the eye ring, because a lot of times this resembles like the Cassin's vireos spectacles. And I've heard this comparison made before, but it wasn't until I saw a really good picture of spectacles that I kind of got it. Now it totally reminds me of spectacles. But another big difference is if you see the solitary sandpiper fly and land, it tends to hold its wings up for a moment, and those underwings are dark as opposed to light of the lesser yellowlegs. So that's an important difference to look for. So Dowitchers, let's go to Dowitchers, because I know this is going to be. I hope you're not disappointed by what I'm going to say. So we got long-billed and short-billed dowitcher fall adults. They really don't look all that different. If you're familiar with the sounds, which I encourage you to listen to on your app, whether it's Merlin or the Scvba app or what have you, listen to the sounds and see what they sound like. I don't think I have a sound recording here, but they really do look pretty similar in fall. Both species look similar. I would say perhaps that the long-billed dowitcher has got more kind of bars on the side of the breast and the belly, the flanks, whereas the short-billed dowitcher tends to have more spots. So there's something that you can look for there, but what I would do instead is, because we're at this unique part of the year where the juveniles are arriving, is to look for the juvenile dowitchers, because those are by far more easily identified. So the tertials, which are the long decorative feathers that cover the primaries, they often reach the tail. So you don't even see the tail much of the time. And you usually don't even see the primaries, but you see these beautiful feathers that overlap the primaries. They're protective. They keep the primaries from excessive UV exposure, etc. So they're plain on the long-billed dowitcher, and in fact, the long-billed dowitcher is fairly plain, even as a juvenile. It's duller overall with a little bit of cinnamon on the back, whereas the short-billed dowitcher is just rich with color. It's golden, it's rufous, and the tertials, instead of being plain in the center, are patterned. So this is probably one of the better things to look for right now. So going from what I just mentioned to you, looking at those tertials, which do you think is the short-billed dowitcher?
A.
That's right, A, because we've got these beautiful patterns inside of the feather, within the border of the feather. Now, people who have seen the dowitchers in breeding plumage might point out, well, the adults in breeding plumage have got these markings on the tertials too, but look at the difference between those bars on the long-billed dowitcher, the lower picture, in breeding adults. They go straight across and outside to the very edge of each tertial, whereas the short-billed has got these interesting kind of curlicues and swirls and tiger stripes inside of the feather, within the edge. So it's going to take some time to recognize these in the field, but we've got great flocks of dowitchers already assembling, and there are good numbers of juveniles showing up. So I would say pay attention to those tertials on the dowitchers, and also pay attention to the sound. And while this is intended to cover a lot of shorebirds and get you introduced, I think the easiest way to learn about shorebird dowitchers is to look at the juveniles. So study in your field guide as well. All right, so I'm going to go to the last few birds here, which are the way out there birds. And I'm talking about way out there, like you need a bike, or you need 2 or 3 or 4 hours to walk around the salt ponds. So we're going to go way out in the alviso ponds, A11, A10, A9, A14, A2W, A2E. We're looking for Phalaropes. So the key to identifying a phalarope is, one, does it swim? Does it swim a lot? Does it spin in a circle? If it does any of those things, you're very likely looking at a phalarope. We've actually got 2 species in this picture. I'm sure some of you can already identify them. The interesting thing about phalaropes, red-necked in particular, is that we see them twice a year. We see them in spring and we see them in fall. In spring, they're going north They've left South America and they're flying north through our bay, through our latitude, to their breeding grounds in the Arctic. And we see them again after breeding when they're coming south to winter in the Bay Area and south of there. What's interesting about this is they appear to us at these times, these magical months, in different plumages. They're in their breeding plumage going north, and they're in the fall plumage, and they're the juveniles when they're heading south. So, for example, here are two of our most common phalaropes in breeding plumage. These are both females. The females are more colorful than the males. And it's because the female is more dominant in the nest duties. So she mates with multiple males. She establishes the territory. The male builds the nest, incubates the young, feeds the young for the first few days. Now, in that time, the male lingers behind in the breeding ground. The female takes off early. She's the first to arrive in the Bay Area, followed by the male, followed by the juveniles. So it's a pretty interesting life cycle. All the phalaropes do this, but the red-necked and the red are the most do that most often. So in their breeding plumage, they're fairly easy to identify. Red-necked phalarope is an Arctic species. Wilson's phalarope is an inland species. It doesn't really migrate over the water like oceanic red phalarope or red-necked phalarope. So this is an inland migrant, whereas the red-necked phalarope is a coastal offshore migrant. So red-necked, again, this is a female, is a beautiful color, really delicate, needle-like bill. But in the wintertime, it loses all those colors and it starts to look frosty and black and white. Now, the juveniles, which show up shortly after, have a little bit of golden and rufous on the back. So this is pretty wonderful. I like to look for the juveniles because they're in fresh plumage, whereas the adults, they have worn plumage, which is why it looks a little less tidy than the juvenile. Now, I also want you to pay attention to the structure of these two birds. Notice that the bill on the Wilson's phalarope on the right is so much longer. And not only is the color arrangement very different, but you'll see that the Wilson's phalarope actually has a longer neck and a different sort of body shape. So here's the female adult in breeding plumage. Here she is in winter plumage. I mean, what a difference. Look at that. So she's lost all that color, and that uniform gray color is a real key feature for this bird. The juveniles, kind of like the juvenile rednecks, show a little bit of rufous, sometimes some gold. They're very colorful, very pretty. They're going to have the same long bill as the adult. Now, sometimes we see birds that are sort of halfway between plumages. That's okay. The long bill and the long neck on the Wilson's phalarope and the more uniform coloration is a good feature. So here we have the Wilson's phalarope again. So you see here, if it wasn't obvious before, here's what I'm talking about with the neck. The Wilson's phalarope tends to have a longer neck, not only a longer bill, but a longer neck, and is a little bit more slender overall. The red-necked phalarope is more compact, and that's a pretty typical posture for the red-necked phalarope. So we're going to be seeing birds in this breeding plumage right now, and basically if you see something with a lot of stripes on the back, lengthwise stripes, it's probably red-necked. If you see something with a very uniform frosty back, that's probably Wilson's. Now they both like saline ponds. They'll both be swimming around, sometimes together, but not necessarily. Sometimes they'll be in segregated groups. Sanderling is another rare bird from the outer ponds. On the coast, these are very easy to see. They chase the waves on the coastal beaches. They're very familiar to anybody who goes to a beach. When we tend to see them, they're frosty white, very snowy white, with often a black shoulder patch you see on the right-hand bird. These are bigger birds than the western sandpipers. They're quite close to turnstone size. So they're significantly sized birds. Side by side with any of the peeps, except perhaps Dunlin, they would seem like a giant. So here they are chasing the waves on the coast. That one's got like a beach flea or something. And you can see the black shoulder patch on, I guess, 3 of these birds. Red knot, another very rare bird, probably reported less often simply because it takes a while to get to the place where you can, reasonably see them. They're usually right on the water's edge on the low tide on the bay. So they're looking for food in the mud, of course, beside the avocets, the Dowitchers, and everything, but they don't like to come close to land. So they're going to be way out in the mud. Difficult to see simply because they're at a distance. Stevens Creek mouth, way at the end, beyond the Google buildings on the bay. That's a good place to look for them. And what you see here is basically breeding plumage, the red knot. That's how it gets its name. In winter, when we tend to see them, they're frosty gray, like so many shorebirds, but the sort of pigeon-shaped body and short bill, which is quite thick at the base, is a good feature. And I'm only pointing these out because they're possibilities, but the emphasis tonight was on the common ones. But I wanted everybody to be aware of these and why they're difficult to see. They're difficult to see because they're very specific in where they want to be. The 2 turnstones are a perfect example. In many places, these are rock-loving species, especially the black turnstone. We don't have a lot of habitat that supports that lifestyle. We don't have rocky coastal breaks in many places. One of the ponds, I think it's A8, has a long rock jetty, but it's, quarter mile away from any scope view. So it's difficult to get a look at it. My guess is that black turnstone is going to show up on those areas more often than we are really aware. The ruddy turnstone is a little less particular about rocky coasts and can often be found on sandy beaches. But again, it's quite rare here. And the place that it's often seen is at the end of San Francisco Creek, on a very peculiar portion of our county where the county lines are difficult to discern. So most of the ruddy turnstone reports that come through eBird are highly scrutinized because it's not clear whether they're in San Mateo County or Santa Clara County. But, that's not what we're concerned with here. Black turnstone is definitely a rock-loving species. So you tend to see it in areas where there are rocks, and some of the outer ponds are good for that. But again, not a common bird. But look at that incredible black and white zebra pattern. This screams disruptive pattern like zebras to me. Both the ruddy turnstone and the black turnstone have similar patterns like this. They're pretty much unmistakable. All right, so places to go. I've mentioned a lot, but the places that are easy to get to and guaranteed to show you some interesting shorebirds are the Palo Alto Baylands. Go on a declining tide probably. When the tide is falling and new fresh mud flats are being revealed so that the birds can find food. The situation is opposite on a rising tide because the invertebrate food animals have probably burrowed down deeply, and they're only going to come back to the surface when the mud is covered. But when the tide is receding, the water is still there as far as the animals are concerned, so it takes them a little while to burrow down deep. So a declining tide is probably best at the Palo Alto Baylands and most other places. The ponds far off to the right are also really wonderful. This is a very blurry picture of Charleston Slough and the Mountain View Forebay. Excellent spots right now, it seems like. This is where we also, on the right hand, we had the recent reports of least bittern. There was a black rail there, in fact, and then, of course, the recent solitary sandpiper. The deeper water, the tidal A1 pond on the left of the image is great for some of the larger shorebirds like godwits, curlew, Whimbrel, and many other shorebirds. This is Grant Boulevard heading into the Environmental Education Center at the Don Edwards Preserve. This is a fabulous place for shorebirds. I'm quite certain there'll be a Baird sandpiper here this season, as well as a ruff. There are often, a pectoral sandpiper has shown up here many times. The combination of the shallow water, the vegetated spits, and the little islands make for great shorebirding here. Probably one of the most productive places to look for shorebirds. And finally, a few resources. There's a new edition of the National Geographic book coming out next month. The 8th edition will be, it's available for pre-sale, pre-order right now on Amazon. And I've already ordered a copy. And that should have the updated taxonomy. And with all that's going on with AviList and Clements and all the checklists, we may find this a 9th edition coming out pretty soon too. But I would pick this up. It's a new author. This would be Ted Floyd. All the maps have been redrawn. All the text has been rewritten. There are many new illustrations. So I'm really looking forward to it. The Shorebird Guide, the one that's most relevant here, is available. It's still in print, I believe, but it's also available on Amazon Marketplace. So just go to the Amazon site. You can find it used and new. And of course, get yourself a checklist if you don't have one already. It's free. It's downloadable from our website. And these 3 things should give you all you need to identify any and all the shorebirds in our county. So make sure you have at least one of these resources here. I also want to point out, if you don't already know, that the eBird website, under the Explore section, Explore Photos and Sounds, an excellent resource for home study. You can go there, you can type in a species name like pectoral sandpiper. You could specify a location, you could specify a date range, you can specify whether there are multiple species or single species. You can look for females and males, etc. And I encourage you to click the multiple species option so you can hunt for the bird you're researching within a picture where you already know the bird is present, but there are also some other things, and you've got to look for those. So that's a great way to study. And the other obvious thing to do is to go on a field trip.